For the record, Canada does not impose a 270% tariff on American dairy products. Initial WTO panels agreed in 2020 and in 2022 that the U.S. had violated free trade rules with respect to China, the EU, Norway, and Turkey. But the U.S. blocked the appointment of judges to the WTO appellate panel, kneecapping the institution and preventing it from reaching a final resolution on any trade dispute. And by the by, President Biden continued to block those judges, meaning that the WTO will remain functionally toothless for another 4 years. But what does a Section 232 trade war look like for normal Americans? Well, the last time around, Trump's Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, a billionaire steel magnate, went on CNBC holding up a beer and a can of soup he claimed to have just picked up at the 7-Eleven to assure Americans that they'd never even noticed the tariffs.
In the can of Campbell's soup, there's about 2.6 cents, 2.6 pennies worth of steel. So if that goes up by 25%, that's about 0.6 of 1 cent on the price of a can of Campbell's soup. So who in the world is going to be too bothered by 0.6 of a cent?
Somehow, Republicans in Congress were not convinced by Wilbur Ross cosplaying as Joe Sixpack, and they begged Trump to call it off. Canada immediately announced that it would enact dollar-for-dollar reciprocal tariffs on American exports of whiskey, orange juice, and other food products. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called the tariffs
an affront to the long-standing security partnership between Canada and the United States, and in particular, an affront to the thousands of Canadians who have fought and died alongside their American brothers in arms.
The European Union, which is also our stalwart ally, announced tariffs on $3 billion of American exports, including Harley-Davidson motorcycles. The import duty on Harleys headed for the EU rocketed from 6% to 31%, massively cutting into the company's profit margin as the Europeans opted to buy their bikes from someone other than the U.S. The Peterson Institute for International Economics said you could not find a better case study than this episode of how the Trump administration's trade policy weakens American export competitiveness. Harley-Davidson responded to the crisis by moving some of its operations to Thailand, where it could export to the EU without the 31% tariff, after which Trump encouraged Americans to outright boycott this American company. In addition to the Trade Expansion Act, Trump invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, commonly known as IEEPA, to justify imposing even more tariffs. In May of 2019, Trump claimed that undocumented immigrants at the southern border constituted an emergency that justified escalating sanctions on Mexico to force it to intercept migrants from Central America and send them back to their countries of origin. Citing IEEPA, he said Mexico's passive cooperation in allowing this mass incursion constitutes an emergency and extraordinary threat to the national security and economy of the United States. And he promised a 5% tariff on all goods imported from Mexico starting June 10, 2019, escalating by 5% a month until it reached 25% in October, where it would stay until the, quote, illegal migration crisis is alleviated. That would have been a disaster for both the U.S. and Mexico, which is one of our biggest trading partners. Billions of dollars of goods move across the southern border every day in both directions. Plus, the timing of the announcement was especially awkward since the Trump administration had just finished hammering out the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, which replaced the North American Free Trade Agreement. Trump pulled us out of NAFTA, insisting that he could get us a much better deal. Republicans in Congress, who had been painstakingly negotiating USMCA with our biggest trading partner, hit the roof. Trump's own staff eventually talked him out of the Mexico tariffs. Instead, they let him go out on June 7th and announced that he was magnanimously relenting after extracting unspecified accommodations from Mexico with respect to the border. In fact, he'd gotten nothing new. His advisors simply talked him out of doing something that would massively damage the U.S. economy going into an election year. In the first Trump administration, the president took his cues from economics advisor Peter Navarro. Navarro was very big on starting a trade war with China, which is hardly surprising since Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, picked Navarro by trawling through Amazon's page on economics and cold calling the guy who wrote such works as The Coming War with China and Death by China. Navarro is obsessed with the trade deficit, which is usually defined as the amount by which a country's imports exceed the value of its exports. Now, Experts are divided on what trade deficits mean for a country's long-term economic health. But the reality is that the U.S. is a rich country, and we have spent most of the last 5 decades negotiating trade deals that allow us to buy vast quantities of cheap consumer goods from poorer countries where production costs are lower. We all decided that we wanted $5 t-shirts from Bangladesh and $300 flat-screen TVs from China or South Korea, 2 countries which buy a lot less stuff from us than we buy from them. And that's fine. It's not like you're running a trade deficit with a haircuttery. You made the decision that you'd rather pay someone else to cut your hair rather than have your mom put a bowl on your head and snip around it. And as someone who's had a home haircut can confirm, that's not economic warfare. But Trump and Navarro believe that other countries are somehow pulling a fast one on us if we buy more sneakers and Halloween costumes from them than they buy cars, soybeans, and Marvel Cinematic Universe movies from us. And so they cooked up a plan to make those countries pay for the dastardly crime of selling us stuff we wanted to buy.